Okay, right, well, thanks for coming. I know there's been a huge amount of interest in the sewerage charge since it was introduced earlier this year. And I will be making the following statement to members of Tynwald this afternoon, which I shall read for you now. The Manx Utilities Authority is a statutory board of Tynwald and is responsible for, amongst other essential services, sewerage treatment and sewerage systems. The purpose of my statement today is to inform Tynwald members that the authority intends to introduce a more equitable method of charging for its sewerage operations. As part of the government's rebalancing strategy, there has been a reduction in sewerage grants provided by Treasury to Manx Utilities. It is planned to eliminate this revenue grant completely, ramping down to a final support payment in 2017 and 2018. In addition, Treasury now requires the Manx Utilities Authority to meet the full cost of its sewerage capital loan repayments, and further, Manx Utilities will also have to pay increasing interest charges to Treasury on these debts. In combination, these three budget rebalancing changes will require Manx Utilities to secure an additional income of £10 million per annum by 2021. In order to avoid going into deficit, the Council of Ministers agreed and Tynwald approved the introduction of sewerage charges from the 1st of April 2014. As members of Tynwald will be aware, this was set at £50 per property for the current financial year, and that it would be necessary to increase this to £100 per property for 2015 and 16 in order to meet the increasing shortfall in Treasury contributions, as I have just highlighted. The authority recognises that the sewerage charge has been controversial and is perceived by many to be inequitable and unfair. The board has subsequently been working with Treasury to identify a more reasonable charging mechanism to take effect from the 1st of April 2015. The most practical option is to introduce a sewerage rate. The sewerage rate would replace the sewerage charge for properties served by the public sewerage system from the start of next financial year. However, in order to achieve this, it will be necessary to amend the Sewerage Act. The proposal is that the new sewerage rate will be set at approximately 62 pence in the pound for 2015-2016, and it is considered that this approach will achieve a more equitable spread than an equivalent £100 flat fee sewerage charge. I would encourage Tynwald members to support the implementation of the sewerage rate within the short time frame available in order to avoid any future use of the sewerage charge. As previously stated to Tynwald, it is proposed the charge for emptying septic tanks will rise to £100 per empty from the 1st of April 2015. In addition, the authority will consult on the proposed implementation of consenting and charging regime for the reception and treatment of trade effluents at the sewerage treatment works. Thank you. So I will now take any questions.
Mr. Cannan, you've always been against this toilet tax, have you not? So you're not?
No, I was against the flat fee charge.
But so you're in agreement that it has to be found, though. But you didn't like the way it was. So this obviously is what you've worked out to get. Is it you've been behind this?
Well, when I agreed to become the chairman of the Manx Utilities Authority, I did so on the basis that we would seek to find a fairer or more equitable way to implement this charge. And that is what the board was in agreement with when I joined, and that is what I believe we have done. Now, it's not a perfect system by any stretch of the imagination, but it is much more equitable than the flat fee system. And given the current direction that Treasury are going with having to rebalance the books and the responsibilities that the board have to maintain a fiscal security for the company, for the Manx Utilities Authority, then not going down this route would have been unacceptable in terms of good governance for the Manx Utilities Authority. So whilst I think the bigger question is going to be around in the future whether the government should provide some sort of support to the Utilities Authority, or whether we should just carry on down this route, which in my view, is going to add, as far as the sewerage charge goes, at least £50 per year for the next three or 4 years. So I think that's the big question.
Just to be absolutely clear, so people were paying £50 this financial year. They were going to be paying £100 next year. How much are they paying? Are they going to pay next year then?
Well, because it was a flat fee of £50 for this financial year, yes, for next financial year, the charge under the flat fee would have been £100. And we were conscious that just doing a flat fee structure of £100 per property raised a huge numbers of questions about being inequitable and being unfair. And to us, the fairest way was therefore to put it onto the rates. Therefore, the calculation in order to make the £100 effectively come in was to put a 62 pence rate in the pound onto rateable values. So that will then be reflected, depending on your rateable value, will be depending on how much you actually pay. So I think we've worked out the mean value to be £160 as the rateable value. So properties whose properties are rated at less than £160 will pay effectively less than the £100 charge, depending on the rateable value. Or if the property is rated over £160, then you'll find that they'll be paying slightly more. But we've done a lot of research, and we've tried to do as much looking into property values as possible. And generally speaking, 70% of rated properties fall below the £160 mark. So we're fairly confident that 70% of ratepayers who we think will adequately reflect more equitably the financial burden in terms of how it's being applied. So,
have you worked out an average per household at all?
The average cost, well,
the average increase amount. Looking at all the rates, is there an average amount?
Well, the average will be £100. That's the average increase. Sorry, the average from the £50 mark is there's another £50 being applied. So yeah. from this year, you're going to see an average £50. But I don't think you can just necessarily apply that. For every house, it's going to be different depending on their rateable value. So if as I said, if your rateable value is less than £160, you may well find, for example, that your total sewerage charge comes to £79 or £80, as I've found on a couple of examples.
Right.
Does this just come out of your normal rates demand? It's in the water rates, is it? Or how?
There will be a separate sewerage rate on the rates bill.
Okay. And given it's based on the rating system, how much more equitable is it? Because there's obviously a lot of criticism that the actual rate system itself is inequitable, and there's a need for rates revaluation.
Well, as you know, Tynwald has a recommendation from a committee that a rates revaluation should take place. But as I said, we look very carefully at the statistics, and we found that 70% of properties on the island were rated at less than this £160 mean point. And then when you start looking at very specific examples, you find, for example, a property in Ballasalla, a two-bedroom property in Ballasalla, might be paying £79, and the value of that property is set at about £200,000 or so, or just above £200,000 on an estate agent site. Yeah. And yet you compare that with a 5-6 bedroom property in Ramsey that is valued at about £850,000, and they're paying, I think the rough calculation, or my calculation, was about £179. So you can see that there's quite a variance, and then we're actually trying to apply this as far as possible based on a rate system that is supposed to be fairly reflecting the sort of value of that property. And therefore, if you then say that, if you then apply that to the premise that those with lower asset value or lower income levels will be living in a less expensive property than someone with a higher income level, then I think that overall we're applying this on a much more equitable basis.